I was very surprised at the amount of people who sent me messages asking me questions about Pinhead and his marijuana growing or his backy growing in the hills of Kentucky, and they you know, the whole check drawing thing. A lot of people want to know more, and so I'm going to go ahead and tell the story. Hopefully I can make it interesting. Everything I'm going to tell you is going to be the truth, nothing but the truth. It's just the way it is. Before I start though, a couple of things. I'm going to do this in a few different parts and just see where it goes, see how many people like it. And understand that 40% of all the marijuana that's grown in the United States comes from the Appalachian regions. So if you didn't know that, you know that now. I did not know that up until a few years ago, but I was schooled in the whole seedy situation. I'm going to discuss an awful lot about check drawing and where that leads you as far as socialism and what develops from that. The 70% of the county where my property happens to be, 70% of those people draw a check from the government. Most of those people have never worked a day in their life, and but they draw a check. Now when I say they've never worked a day in their life, understand they've never legitimately worked. A lot of them are very hard-working people, but they just have worked the system, and they are products of the system in a lot of different ways. So bear with me. We'll cover all that as the story unfolds. So I'll start at the very, very beginning. In 2005, I purchased 482 acres of land in southeast Kentucky. The reason that I purchased this land was to develop it for its natural resources. So for me, that meant having the timber cut off the property, having the coal extracted out of the property, and then drilling for gas and oil. I did diverge a little bit from that plan in the sense that there was an area where I could go ahead and put a couple of wells long before the end, but that's neither here nor there. So whenever you develop property, there's stages that it goes. It's like building a house. You know, you've obviously got to build the foundation before you put up the walls and the roof and all that stuff. So everything goes in stages when you're developing a piece of property. So the first stage for me was to have the timber cut. So I buy this property, and then I purchased a 3-bedroom house adjacent to the property, actually in this holler. And it's actually, well, it's pronounced holler in southeast Kentucky, but if you read a map, it'll say hollow. And what it means is, for those of you who are not familiar, it's basically a valley surrounded on 3 sides by mountains. So there's one way into this valley and one way out of this valley. So I bought this house in the holler because I knew that I was going to have to spend a tremendous amount of time there. Now I don't live, technically I do not live in southeast Kentucky. I live in northern Ohio. But I knew I was going to have to spend a lot of time there, so I needed a home base. When I originally bought the property, I was living out of a hotel in southeast Kentucky, and that wasn't going to work for me. So I bought this house, and it was really a perfect location. It was just a stroke of luck that this house actually came up for sale, because basically it's right there surrounded by all my property that I was going to develop. So I put the timber up for sale. You know, before I get to that, I'll tell you, I get this house, and the house needed a lot of work. Had been rented out. The person who owned the house previous to me had rented it out to HUD. And HUD had some people in there that, you know the old saying, don't be gentle, it's a rental. I mean, they just destroyed this place. So I was working on the house, trying to get it livable. It had a really cool front porch to it. So I was taking a break, and evening was here, and I was sitting out there enjoying a beer. And I'm watching, and remember, one way in, one way out. Okay, and there's about 12 houses in this holler. I'm sitting on the porch, and I counted 50 cars coming and going out of this holler. And they were all going, most of them were going to one house up at the head of the holler. And they'd be there for like 2 minutes, and they'd turn around and they'd book on out of the holler. Well, you know, I'm a product of the big city. I know a drug house when I see one. and I thought to myself, isn't this beautiful? There's a drug house in the holler, which I found really kind of interesting because I mean it was just so, the whole place was so Norman Rockwell-ish. It was very cute. And so the next day, I walked down to a couple of my neighbors and I said, well, there's a lot of traffic coming in and out of this holler, and they all just kind of, you could tell, well, I was the stranger. I mean, I'd talked to these people before, but I was kind of, they still didn't know me, you know, but you could tell there's one guy there who had just gotten out of the Air Force and had actually grew up in that holler and left that holler 20 years previously, put his 20 years in, retired from the Air Force, came back to the holler. And so he was a little more easygoing than the rest of them. He said to me, he goes, yeah, this guy, his name's Frito, he's a big drug lord. He said, that son of a bitch, I wish he was out of here. But they were all scared of him. Ironically enough, I mean, even the guy that spent 20 years in the Air Force was scared of this drug dealer. Like he said to me at one point, he said, hey, he goes, I got 3 kids. So, and the big thing down there is to burn people's houses in the middle of the night while they're sleeping. You know, it's a rough part of the country. So, nobody wants their house burned down, so nobody says anything, you know, to Frito about what's going on. But I had went down there and talked to Frito. Strangely enough, Frito's deed called for 1/4 of an acre, and he had this big swath of land fenced in. Little compound, he had electric fence, he had dogs. It was really something to see. And but he had fenced in a bunch of my property. So I went down there to talk to Frito and to tell Frito he needed to take that fence down. And I noticed when I got up to Frito's house there was a cop car in the driveway, and I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. It was a state police officer. A state police vehicle, I should say. Actually, it was vehicle control. State of Kentucky vehicle control or something to that effect. But anyway, it was a cop car nonetheless. And so I walk up there and I knock on the door. And old Frito comes out and it's like, what can I do for you? And I said to him, I said, look, I said, and he, by the way, everybody called him Frito, and he referred to himself as Frito. Don't ask me why. I said to him, I said, Frito, I said, you're going to have to take this fence down. I said, you know, I've got this big project going on, and I said, you know, you got to take this fence down. And he said, I'm not taking this fence down. I said, well, Frito, it's on my property. He said, that's my property. I'm like, okay. I said, listen, I said, I got a copy of your deed. I said, you got 1/4 of an acre. I said, you've obviously got well over 1/4 of an acre fenced in. He goes, it's my property. I said, okay, well, Frito, I'm going to have to get a surveyor out here. I said, but, you know, when he's done surveying it, I expect you to respect my property lines. He goes, you can get a surveyor out here if you want, but I ain't taking the fence down. I'm like, okay, so that's the way that's going to be. So I go down to the sheriff's department, and I said, listen, I said, I've got a drug dealer at the end of my holler. I said, there's a shitload of traffic coming and going. I said, there's a cop car there. I said, I don't know what the story is with that. I said, but, you know, I need you to do something about this. I said, and I said, the guy's got my property fenced in. And so the sheriff looks at me and goes, where's this at? And I told him, and he goes, oh, yeah. He goes, Frito. He goes, well, you know, he goes, I just don't have the manpower. He goes, I know it's a drug house. He goes, you know, but with this war in Iraq, they've cut my budget, and I just don't, what am I going to do? I ain't got kids, nothing I can do. This is the sheriff. I said, well, I said, you know, I said, how about, you know, you don't have to spend a lot of money. I said, but when somebody comes running into the holler, two minutes later runs out, I said, pull them over, they're going to have drugs on them. I said, and, you know, all roads lead back to Frito. But basically, bottom line, the sheriff had absolutely no intentions of helping me whatsoever in dealing with Frito. So, all right, I'm going to stop this here, and then I'll come back to it because I don't want to make each one of these really, really long.